ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, honored guests. There was no plan of this speech. As scientific coordinator, as Stefan Kuhlermann already mentioned, of Crossroads Asia, I have the honor to basically express a second welcome to you and then share the first panel. Crossroads Asia is Competence and Research Network financed by the German Ministry of Education and Research. Critically reflects on the conventional areas and their boundaries that until today basically act as defining bases for South Asian studies, for Central Asian studies, as well as Iranian studies. And we do this, we critically reflect on these, not by subscribing to geographic definitions of space as a container demarcated by clear borders and with a certain set of characteristics to be found on the inside, but instead we focus on the mobility of people, the mobility of ideas and images that travel the world, basically. We therefore focus on flows, which we conceptually grasp as spatial as well as social and mental mobility. Within the network's research, we do this by focusing on three themes, namely on conflict, migration and development. These are three themes that play a crucial role in the everyday life experiences of many people that live in the region that, as Stefan mentioned, extends from eastern Iran to western China and Aral Sea to roughly northern India. But today and tomorrow, we will look at what the sociologists Peter Berger and Thomas Luckmann call the highest level of legitimation. We ask after the role of different religious belief systems in legitimizing and also in encouraging human action and human practices, basically by offering frames for sense-making and for attaching meaning, and this they do irrespective of physical and social boundaries. And as you might have noticed in our program, we also take our focus on flows and on the mobility of ideas seriously and follow the employment of these different religious belief systems. This time, now, the next 2 days, basically from the Middle East to Malaysia, as well as from the Philippines to then the Yemen and Egypt. So far beyond the countries that we usually look at. But now in our first panel, here we focus on religious tradition as a crucial element in global networks and also how these are affected by trends of globalization. So I'm very happy to introduce you to Professor Tulasi Srinivas, as well as Professor Jakob Rösel. Professor Srinivas is a trained anthropologist of religion with a particular focus on India and Pakistan, and here particularly on Hinduism. She is a professor at the Emerson College in Boston, Massachusetts, and has in the past held several prestigious fellowships, such as from the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace and World Affairs, or also from the Center for the Study of World Religion of Harvard University. Currently, Tulasi Srinivas is a visiting research fellow at the Ruhr-Universität Bochum, where she is leading a research project on forging faith, ambivalent globalization, and innovative ritual in Hindu temple publics of Bangalore. So I'm very happy to welcome you here today, and I invite all of you to maybe travel with you to Bangalore City. Thank you.
Because my previous book dealt with spatial migration. It dealt with the Saptasai movement in 6 different continents. It dealt with how religion globalizes. However, in this paper, I didn't expect to be the first speaker. So I assumed that people would talk about migration and spatial exchange before I spoke. Thomas Cookman invoked, because Peter Berg was my advisor for my PhD dissertation, out of which this work has arisen. So basically, I'm going to recruit your imagination to look at ritual change and ritual in Hinduism, in Hindu temple publics in Bangalore city. So on January 13th, 2009, I don't know if you can see this. Anyway, on January 13, 2009, I stood in a darkened doorway in a neighborhood of Malaysian in Bangalore city, watching the Kanu Pandige festival. Kanu comes from Kanya, or girl, and Pandige means festival. The procession of the local Krishna temple had swung past me going down a street. The city was suffering from one of its periodic energy-saving rolling blackouts without electricity, and so the neighborhood was pitch dark. The only light was from a few hissing gas lamps that vendors had placed on their wooden carts where they were selling bananas. But despite the darkness, the street was thick with people, 2 and 3 deep, who stood on pavements and roadways to watch the procession, many bowing to the deities as they swung by. They were carried aloft on a beautifully decorated wooden palaki or palanquin, and many people were taking cell phone pictures of the deities and of the procession as a whole. One could easily pick out the procession even from far away, because it was a glowing orb of light and a wall of sound. The solar bright video lights and flame flares of the procession formed a halo around the thick knot of priests who surrounded the colorful deities, reciting liturgy and waving yak hair fly whisks. The temple musicians who played traditional Carnatic music on the mridangam, the drum, and flutes, in a particular syncopated rhythm, and 8-beat. Following up the rear was a group of dancing urchins who picked up coins that were thrown by the crowd to the deities, and they were followed in turn by stray dogs. The female deities on the palanquin were richly bejeweled, clothed in silk and gold, and decorated with sweet-smelling jasmine garlands. They were raised high above the devotees' heads, carried by 8 sweaty young men, one of whom was wearing a green nylon shirt that said, "Just do it." The key palanquin bearer, whose name was Raju, he was 37 at the time, worked in a government office during the day, but as a male member of the Golla caste, that is the milk herder caste, who claimed fictive kinship with the deity Krishna, he had the hereditary privilege to lift the palanquin, as he said. He had perfected the necessary hair-raising skill of walking backwards into traffic while directing the palanquin. Suddenly, Raju stumbled backwards over a pile of stones in the middle of the street. The palanquin bearer stumbled after him, and they nearly tipped the palanquin over. So one of the older men in the procession looked at his beautiful old watch and said with annoyance, "Oh God, now we'll be even later. They won't like it." He said this in English. Babu Bhattar, the chief priest, briskly said, "Okay, I thought they would have cleared these stones by now, but they haven't. We'll have to go another route. Let's try Sampige Road." Raghava, one of the younger priests, looked at Babu with disbelief. "How can we do that? The traffic will make us so late." All this was said in English except for the priest, who said it in Tamil. Yet another younger priest, Neelakanta, also said in English, "Hold on." Then he turns to Tamil. "I think it'll be okay. I got an SMS, cell phone message, text message, from my friend. He says he got the Navaram Theatre across Sampige Road in 10 minutes. Then all the procession turned and spoke to the priest who was looking worried. He said, "Bhatru, oh priest, Solpa adjust martini, yen sankocha martpalbedi." That he said in Kannada. He says, "Don't worry, we'll adjust a bit." Now at this point I had watched the procession 3 times, from 1999 to 2004. I was not to know that I was to watch it 3 more times, and it would capture my imagination as a narrative and heuristic device to look at ritual in Bangalore. For in the Krishna temple, as in many Vaishnavite and Shaivite temple publics in South India that trace their roots to Tamil culture, either real or fictive, the social mores of the Kanu Pandige festival enacted by the deities actually the social mores of the people themselves. Here, the female consorts of the male deity go back in a ritual homecoming to their natal family, their father's family. They arrive as married daughters to this Brahmin family who acts as their parents. The Brahmin family celebrates their arrival. They gift them, they feed them, and they treat them as married daughters who have come home. Meanwhile, the male deity, Krishna, in his warrior kingly mode, rides after them in anger. This second procession, known as the Perumal procession, is filled with frustration and anger of the deity, looking for his truant wives. But while we were watching the procession, Shubha, a young female devotee of 32 years old, said, she was praying to the gods. When she opened her eyes, she looked at me and said, "Yes, this is beautiful, no? Look how beautifully it's decorated. So nice. It makes me peaceful just to see it. It makes us forget all our worries. The gods are just like us. Or maybe I should say that we're better, that we are like them. They too have worries. See the Taya, that's the mother, the female deities. They're going to their father's house. It's been so long since I could go to my family, my native place, to visit them. My job is here. My husband is here. What to do?" She turns to the young man next to her. Then she says in Tamil, "This is viraha. This is a moment of, this is a life of separation, to live in a separated state." Now, this notion of separation, of viraha, comes out of the Navarasa and is played through the performative tradition of South India, particularly through bhakti texts, through the poetry of bhakti texts, and through, say, even Bharatanatyam recitals. It even plays through Bollywood sort of movie musicals as the state of longing for the beloved who is away. But viraha is basically an agentive state of waiting. It's not waiting passively. It's waiting through time for something to change. So there is a feeling of longing and lament. The bhakti poetry is all about lament, about how the beloved is far away. And there is posited within viraha state, the subjunctive state of unification with God. So in the present, yes, we are separated, there is cleavage in the present, but in the future, in this wished for future, there will be binding with the deity. Recently in religious studies, as we have heard, we've experienced the mobility turn, where the effect of globalization and increased mobility, including the hyper-movements of people, capital, culture, goods, ideas, communication, imagination, ontology, and the tension and delight they articulate and deploy is at the forefront of interrogation. Importantly, mobility gestures to spatial freedom that we cut across national boundaries, the freedom to roam, to be nomadic, to search for variable and better futures. I, however, will argue that mobilities and moorings occur dialectically, where the image of political economic space is complex and a mosaic of superimposed and interpenetrating nodes does not actually answer the question I'm asking. Rather, a shift towards more complex, polymorphic, multi-scalar, and polytemporal spaces that are linked to the emergence of complex mobility systems allows us to pivot to question time itself. So the procession as a ritual form gestures not only the obvious mobility of the deity and the priests and devotees, but the circuits of mobility through the city, that is Bangalore city. Bangalore city is interesting because it is the center of the knowledge-aware industry for one of the top cities in the whole of Asia. The GE Center in Bangalore filed 300 patents in the year 2001, and it has increased exponentially since then. So it deals with information technology. So here we're not questioning a privilege or privileging a mobile subjectivity, the tracking of power and the micropolitics of discourse. Rather, what I'm looking at is how this mobility then influences local moral worlds. I'm looking at temporality and the gyroscopic shifts that occur in temporality toward the fluidity of ritual itself. In talking of time, I specifically speak the apparatuses and assemblages of the future. It is to this futurativity, this subjunctive notion of the future, that my work will speak to today. Here I am building on Michael Puett's work when he speaks on ancient Chinese ritual, and he talks about ritual as domesticating danger towards a hope for future. So this future-looking orientation opens up now spaces in the imagination for thinking about processing change to go beyond instrumental imaginaries, and where semiotic modalities are created from existing vocabularies and material practices. They are augmented to explore the politics of possibility to engage this strange and new world. To think through the notion of the subjunctive, I will meditate upon seeds of newness and change, and the oscillation and fluctuation of ritual process. Now this is Bangalore, it's the metro. It was being built in 2008-2009, it's just finished. This is traffic, which is a horrendous mess. So we get this city that looks towards the future in its imagination, its capacity to build software and knowledgeware. At the same time, in the present, it's a very degraded city. You get all the brand names, a city of capital expenditure. This is a fake New York style skyscraper in the center of Bangalore. The top floor is a bar where the rich and famous of Bangalore and the intelligentsia hang out. Now, Bangalore has noted that the network is in the first instance metaphorical. So I was very happy when Anna talked about the imagination. Because this emerging mobilities paradigm argues against the ontology of places and people. Rather, I connect them through these performances and performativities that are set in the imagination of the participants. So let me get back to Shubha's point about cleaving and binding, viraha. In the procession of cosmological understanding of time, this is the temple, the Krishna temple. This is the priest Babu Bhatta to your left, that's his father. And the Krishna temple lit in the evening. This is the day of the procession. You can see the procession leaving on your right hand side. In the procession, a cosmological understanding of time is set at odds with a human understanding of time. Within the human understanding, there are two frames. That of Hindu calendrical time set on the lunar calendar that sets the procession as a movable feast, and the notion of Western modern time indicated by the informant's watch and the variable delay. Now these are the 5 parts of the procession which I just put up so that you're very clear. Now we're used to a Western chronological understanding of time. And here I asked Babu Bhatta how the Western notion of time differs from the Hindu notion of time. And here he's offering the sacred camphor flame to the deity. Now he answers me. In the West, as I understand it, he says America, but he means the West. The arrow of time, it is like an arrow, bana, like a bow and arrow. He's describing it as progress in the modernist European way in the most limited sense of the word. Here the notion of future is seen as distant and unforeclosable. When I asked Shubha and the other informants about the technology of the cell phone or other modern inventions and their recent nature, the nature of change in the order of clothing or the way the deities were decorated, and whether it changed the Sanskritic 1,000-year-old ritual of the procession or the 100-year-old procession within this temple precinct, they said no. Babu Bhatta himself said, I don't know, in a gesture of hand waving. But then Mr. Raghava, one of the informants, said to me, how can we tell about change? How can we tell about time? This is questioning time itself. And here for time he uses the word kala. And he says that merely different dimensions of God's face. When I asked Babu Bhatta about kala, time, and the notion of dimensions within space, and repeating Shubha, talking about viraha, the emotional cleavage and separation, he says, we as humans divide up time. In reality, time is flowing, yuge, yuge, epoch after epoch, but not in one direction. It is twisted. It is not like we can see clearly. If we could see clearly, we would be like Krishna himself. We only know as human beings that it passes. Mr. Simha said in contradiction, we only know that it seems to move forward. Things get more and more bad, more and more disorganized, more and more evil. In the beginning there was Satya Yuga, the Yuga of truth, the epoch of truth, then Treta, then Dwapara, and now it is Kali Yuga. Kali Yuga is all about evil. So then I turn to Babu and I say, is this true? He says, let me tell you a story. In the morning, the god Brahma takes his water pot and goes to the toilet. And he finishes his toilet and comes out with an empty water pot. And by that time, for us, one yuga has passed. So Brahma's time is worth several billion years of human time. So this is God's cosmological time set against human time. So here we have, in this short description between Mr. Simha and Babu and myself, we get 3 different notions of time. We get the Western, Babu's perception of the Western notion of time as an arrow, metaphor of an arrow. Then we get the difference between Brahma's time, cosmological time, and human time. And then we get this notion of entropy, that the whole world is progressing towards an evil state of disorganization. Besides this, this is layered on top of Hindu calendrical time itself, in which the Kanu Pandya festival shifts based on the Hindu lunar calendar versus the Gregorian Western solar calendar, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. So then I go back to Mr. Simha and I said, what is it about Kali Yuga that bothers you? He said, you see what we're doing today, referring to the Kanu Pandya festival. What we do is critical. It's important to keep the meaning of goodness, and use the word good in English, of the world. And this I interpret as him saying it allows humans to harness, this ritual allows humans to harness the power of the gods of the universe towards holding back evil. This domestication and repairing work of the world, again I'm quoting Puet, that ritual performs is in fact a mooring for human emotions and human energies. It gives human beings a vision of, in the imagination of the hope for subjunctive future against the reality of entropy as they perceive it. This hope for mooring action of ritual process makes human beings philosophically need ritual, according to Puet, against the seeming entropy of time. But Babu continues our discussion. I have video, but I don't think I can see it here. Here are the Walla men carrying the deity. Here you see the Nike t-shirt that Just Do It, which I think speaks to time as well. The sort of modern government worker woman carrying the flare, because it's a hereditary right. This is the video. Of God to us. People's atmas, souls, transmigrate through samsara. They suffer, bound to the earth by itch of desire. But then he said briskly, but anyway, all this is Maya, illusion. In reality, what is important is shunyata, emptiness or nothingness. This is what is meaningful. Total nirvana. This is the aspiration. This is the end. Sharanagati or surrender. So for Babu and other devotees, philosophically, while the grand cycles of time appear unchanging, and end only in nothingness and surrender, and the rest is illusion, in the real and material world of cell phones and wristwatches, newness dribbles through. So while ritual time appears unchanging, it is constantly on the move, as the procession is. See, the two female deities. But it is on the move like a gravestone. It is about perception, this opening cosmogenic discourse out of which primal ineffable energies emerge, reorients not only the philosophical goals but the pragmatic ones, thereby reordering time itself and setting up different dimensions and values for those dimensions. Babu and the priests attending to the female deities, the two female deities as they were getting dressed, identical. Here's Babu offering jackfruit to the deity, offering strawberries, this is newness. The deity being worshipped by the community of Globalized. If I clearly don't have time for this video, but I can show it in the question session if you have time for it, because it shows the procession walking, which is a particular walk. Here's the Perumal deity dressed as a king on top of his horse. Me staring at him. And the procession coming back with the dimensions is critical for it speaks to futurity. Can we predict the future is the question that Babu is asking. For devotees, for devotees, while prognostication or seeing the future is interesting, the future is still a void. Informants argue that because the future is occluded, it creates anxiety and fear. The mobility of time is not something that they look forward to. But doing the ritual allows one to project into the future in a subjunctive wishful state. Thus, ritual is a dynamic place in time as it seems to be constantly shifting. Constant transformation, towards that transformation, the new is constantly invoked and deployed as part of transformative energy. I'm just going to take 30 seconds more. Babu says, we see everything is happening now, but is it happening now or is it permeating from one space to another? When he asks these questions about ritual and the way we see ritual play out, he's asking about change. And when I asked Babu, finally, this January, it occurred to me in reading this, I asked him this January, what is Kala? He says, Kala is Nirantara, without end. It is Avichana, which is uninterrupted, eternal. Then he says, Kala is Sudhana, which is a heap of sand. There's an orderly disorder. This granular notion of time is what I want to investigate further. What is new, Tulasi, he says. What is old is what is new. What is new is what is old. The sense of the future unfolding, of recycling what is in the past, our granular heaping towards the future is the certainty within this shifting dynamic of the ritual. Time is experienced not as continuous, but as continuously ruptured, where ritual events like the procession become grains marking time. This understanding of mobilities and moorings that I deal with in this space and time, I argue take what is a spatial metaphor and apply it to time, to get at the notion of future and newness. So as Rifkin notes, things are not static, fixed and given. Rather, they note, as Babu does, that they appear endlessly as hard and fast entities and events that continuously change rather like a movie. In this context, then, I ask of mobilities, how do we frame questions and methods that are appropriate to social research in a context in which durability is about knowing? In sum, I suggest that emerging forms of ritual demonstrate that the subjunctive is near at hand when formed. It is ultimately a hopeful understanding of our world. Thank you.
Thank you, Tulasi. I will now, in the interest of time, would suggest that we will straight away move to the second presentation and then have a panel discussion. So I am very happy to introduce you to Professor Rösel. Professor Rösel holds a chair in International Politics and Development Cooperation at the University of Rostock. His particular focus lies on India and Pakistan and on ethnic and nationalistic conflicts as well as migration processes. So basically he links to two main core themes of the Crossroads Asia network. Before taking on the chair at the University of Rostock, Professor Rösel was involved in postgraduate studies at the University of Chicago. He worked for the Institute of Sociology at the University of Freiburg, as well as the Arnold Bergstresser Institute in Freiburg. And he is currently continues to be the editor of the Internationales Asien Forum that many of you will know. So I'm very happy to welcome Professor Rösel here today. And he will now talk on the Tamil diaspora.
Thank you very much. I will speak on the Tamil diaspora. Since the middle of the 19th century, British strategic dominance, financial investments and migration policies contributed to the growth of mass-based and increasingly rural Indian diasporas. Many of the Indian migrants were Tamils. Around 1940, nearly all of the 2 million migrants settled in Sri Lanka, most of the 800,000 in Malaya, and many of the 1 million in Burma were Tamils. In addition, among those settled in Mauritius, East Africa, Natal, South Africa and Fiji, there were sizable minorities of Tamils. It is therefore not unreasonable to assume that probably more than 3 of the 4.5 million overseas Indians in the 1940s of the Indian Ocean area were Tamils. Completely unforeseen, yet basing itself on century-old experiences and cooperating with long-established Tamil trading and moneylender castes, there emerged by now a Tamil mass diaspora consisting out of lower caste workers and untouchables, overwhelmingly employed in plantations and mines. They were recruited, accompanied and controlled by Kanganis, traditional low-caste labor contractors who had been in the business of organizing a pliable lumpenproletariat for the Dutch VOC and the English East India Company since the 18th century on Sri Lanka as well as in South India. How could Hindus living in a caste system based on the inequality and often untouchability of fellow men travel and even migrate quite freely inside and far beyond India? It is through 4 mechanisms that the caste system, against all odds, facilitated traveling and migration, thereby giving rise to a specifically Hindu mode of mobility and diasporic movement. First, to the degree that the caste system had been established in India and beyond, migrants could count on a minimum of service castes. Secondly, since centuries, prosperous high-caste Hindu travelers were accompanied by their own caste retinues or caste differentiated servants. Thirdly, poor low-caste migrants who could not afford these India-wide or accompanying service castes relied on self-support or public charity that they could procure their own food, water, firewood and cooking utensils. Fourthly, in the wider world of purity and pollution, everything is relational, open to interpretation. Dirt is never at the wrong place, and everything can be corrected through proper ritual. Therefore, wherever Tamil diaspora group established themselves, they formed complex societies where every component group was separate, unique, at arm's length and indispensable. As every diaspora, the Tamil diaspora has to operate, has to define itself on 3 levels. On an historical, second on a local, and thirdly on an international level. It has to define itself via its idealized or forgotten homeland. It has second to adjust itself to a vastly different local, politically dominant and often demanding host population and nation state. Finally, it has to organize and inject itself into the regional and global network of Tamil diaspora groups. In addition, there are no clear-cut boundaries to the diasporas outside or inside. Out of necessity, diasporas thus had to produce, via its 3 levels of exchange, an hybrid culture. Therefore, an overall view of the global Tamil diaspora is less rewarding than a case study on its operation. With this in mind, I now turn to the operation of a specific Tamil diaspora. In the following, I will concentrate on the emergence of the Sri Lankan, the Jaffna Tamil diaspora, and its role in the Sri Lankan ethnic civil war, a war between the Sinhalese majority state and government and the so-called Tamil Tigers, the LTTE from 1983 to May 2009. At least since a millennium, Tamils have settled in the north and along the east coast of Ceylon, Sri Lanka. This Sri Lankan Tamil society, especially in the north on the Jaffna Peninsula, rested on its own Brahmin-free, truncated version of a peasant, a Velala-dominated caste society. Velalas, nearly 50% of the population, controlled all the land and ruled over a vast array of menial castes and untouchables. It were the Velala peasants, not the Jaffna Rajas, who were born to rule. In an astonishing and 3-century-long process of selective borrowing and adaptation, the Velalas profited enormously from Portuguese, Dutch and British colonial rule. The Portuguese destroyed the small Hindu kingdom, while the missions, foremost the Jesuits, took full control over the small peninsula. 36 mission churches and parishes were sufficient to transform the Velalas into good Catholics. The Velalas took full advantage of the Jesuits and the missionary schools to become fully literate, not so much in Portuguese, but in that Tamil which the Jesuits used for translation, for the staging of Christmas and Easter spectacles at various morality plays. Under the British, education was at the beginning neglected and later, after 1820, conceded to American Baptist missionaries. These Yankees were practical men and pioneers. Besides the conventional curriculum, they taught engineering skills, sciences, law, accounting, and the techniques of land measurement. In short, the liberal professions. All these developments had momentous results on the highly conservative as well as now highly Anglophone Velala. Since 1840, the British had developed a highly qualified bureaucratic civil service on the cheap. First with Christian burghers, that is, the mixed descendants of the Dutch, and then with Protestant or Hindu Velalas. The Sinhalese Buddhists were either too uneducated or too much interested in land speculation and rubber and coconut investments. Thus, the Jaffna Velala elite turned itself into a Sri Lanka-wide government service diaspora. It was stationed all over the island in all the district headquarters. It was only natural that parallel to the spread of empire and to the build-up of a South Indian Tamil diaspora, they would follow the spread of empire and the scramble for Africa. Thus, highly educated and self-confident Jaffna Velala served as accountants, notaries, judges, doctors and engineers in Cape Town, Nairobi, Kampala, Kuala Lumpur and Singapore. In Kuala Lumpur there was even till today an official Little Jaffna. Unofficial Little Jaffnas exist nearly everywhere inside the greater, the South Indian Tamil diaspora. It was thanks to dynasties of Velala lawyers, by now residing in Colombo, that the Jaffna Tamils, in reality the Velalas, now acquired political clout. The Velalas were also in need of such spokesmen and political brokers. Since the First World War, Buddhists, revivalists and nationalists increasingly depicted the Tamils in government service as beneficiaries and clients of the British imperialists. As they declared, and still today declare, Tamils can go everywhere, Sinhalese can go nowhere. In 1930, the British granted unlimited voting rights and de facto self-government to the Sri Lankan parties. Sinhalese government rule, based on a 2/3 Buddhist Sinhalese majority in parliament, was now, till today, the result of ethnic polarization and the sudden introduction of mass politics. Here, the 70-year-long development of ethnic polarization, radicalization and civil war cannot be told. Of interest here is the role of the general Tamil and more specifically Sri Lankan Tamil diaspora in the ethnic civil war from 1983 to 2009. When the civil war started, the Tamil Tigers, the LTTE, had already transformed itself from a Velala student and graduate organization into a more broad-based and lower caste-based criminal as well as underground organization. Prabhakaran, an engineer by profession, a fisherman by caste, and stemming from the fishing and smuggling center of Velvetitorai near to South India, now dominated till the end the organization. At this time, the LTTE still operated from a compound in suburban Madras. It could not only count on the solidarity of the 60 million Tamils of Tamil Nadu, but also on the connivance of the two dominant regional parties in Tamil Nadu, one run by a Tamil mega movie star, MGR, and his lover, Jaya Lalita, the other run by the journalist, scriptwriter, and former creator and then antagonist of MGR, Muthuvel Karunanidhi. In addition, the LTTE could rely on geography and a 3-century-old tradition of clandestine trade, smuggling and gun running between the Jaffna Peninsula and the 8 sailing hours distant South Indian coast. There existed thus ties of kinship, interest and loyalty between fishing caste, traders and party leaders. These ties guaranteed that the coast and the hinterland of Tamil Nadu would serve the LTTE as a staging area, training ground and sanctuary. Yet to wage war, money must be added to logistics. And it was here that a by now globalized Tamil diaspora proved essential. First with decolonization, then with the onset of globalization, the general Tamil diasporas had relocated and expanded much beyond the Indian Ocean rim. Impressive South Indian Tamil communities had by now settled in North America, Europe and Australia. Yet of much greater importance was the refugee-making and diaspora-making dynamic of the conflict itself. Prabhakaran and his Foreign Affairs Councillor Anthony Balasingam, a British passport holder, probably did not plan to generate through military escalation and terror their own diaspora of Velala refugees, but they certainly exploited this side effect to the hilt. From 1983, the conflict became concentrated on the north and the east of the island. At the same time, most of the Jaffna Tamils were forced out of Colombo and the other towns in the Sinhalese majority areas. The Sri Lankan Tamils were thus transformed into a community in which every third person was a refugee. Most of these refugees were IDPs, internally displaced persons. Their camps served as areas for LTTE recruitment and infiltration. The fishing communities and the more mobile but poor peasants would flee to South India into the obsolete so-called cyclone shelters. These camps operated as training grounds. They secured the weapon supply but also the smuggling operations through which Prabhakaran financed at least part of his liberation wars. But the most valuable refugee contingent were the educated young male Velalas who had the family networks, flight tickets and language qualifications to try their luck in the West. In the 1980s, refugees seeking political asylum in the West were still accepted, even in either xenophobic or bureaucratic Germany. In Quebec, in Francophone Canada, in the USA, in Australia, Switzerland and in Scandinavia there were few restrictions. In Quebec, for instance, every Tamil immigrant was welcome as long as he was willing to learn French and increase the statistical weight of the Francophones. At the beginning of the 1990s, the LTTE thus could count on a Western Tamil Velala diaspora of its own making. It probably comprised not less than 600,000 people. From the beginning, the LTTE secured its access to and its monopoly control over this diaspora, their own globalized network. This Velala diaspora was used to finance the Elam Tamil liberation wars, to influence the public opinion, media, academia, and politicians, especially in the United States. It was employed to establish an LTTE-controlled business empire, and last but not least, It provided the means to buy weapons from the Ukraine to Cambodia and ship them to Jaffna. LTTE representatives would help refugees to apply for citizenship, find housing and employment. As remuneration, the LTTE would demand continuous war contributions in the average of some 10% of the refugees' income. A refusal to comply resulted in economic ruin, social isolation and loss of faith. Most importantly, the close relatives back in Jaffna would be intimidated or they would disappear, only to reappear as boys, as suicide bombers and martyrs. In London, the LTTE ran its own information and research center, the Tamil International Research Unit. It supplied the media and the public with Elon-specific background information. In the United States, many renowned Tamil University scholars would defend and propagate the Tamils and at least implicitly the Tigers' viewpoint and grievances. The American political system invites migrants and minority groups to organize themselves and lobby for their demands. Tamils, that is LTTE spokesmen, therefore try to influence their congressmen. Many prospering and innocuous business enterprises inside or outside the various little Jaffnas were at least partly owned and controlled by the LTE. As the Jaffna diaspora had emerged as a money-ordered economy, where the rich overseas relatives assisted their families back home, the LTTE, staffed by accountants, could use this network for their own financial purposes. Now, while the Western, the globalized Jaffna diaspora was of paramount financial and political importance, the greater, the South Indian Tamil diaspora of the Indian Ocean Rim was essential for the war economy, the waging of the war. With the help of the general Tamil diaspora, especially in Singapore, Kuala Lumpur and South Africa, the LTTE operated unknown to outsiders their own shipping lines. It was from here that it explored the weapons markets in impoverished or failing states, be it the Ukraine, Zimbabwe or Burma. Prabhakaran's Tamil diaspora and network, therefore, was multifunctional, multi-layered and certainly impressive. It consisted first out of a self-produced, globalized, highly qualified Velala diaspora in the West. It relied second on low-caste, impoverished Sri Lankan refugees in Tamil, one page only. Thank you. It relied second on low-caste, impoverished Sri Lankan refugees in Tamil Nadu, as well as on the solidarity of the 60 million of South Indian Tamils and their politicians. Most importantly, third, this Jaffna diaspora cooperated with and merged into the greater and very prosperous Tamil communities in Malaysia, Singapore, South Africa, and most importantly, the West. But still, in the end, in 2009, the whole network was of no avail. Prabhakaran's bunker system, suicide squads, and his human shield were battered and destroyed by a 100,000 strong Sinhalese army with incredible, never investigated civil casualty, assumed around 40,000 civilian dead, but it was never brought before any international court or whatever. In conclusion, I want now to return to this conference's question: can networks mobilize religion, or equally important, can religion mobilize networks? Let's start with the second question. Religion can mobilize networks, diasporas. The caste system, far from preventing travel, migration and networking, has against its primordial, its inner logic, contributed to travel and trade, not only inside, but soon enough beyond India. Caste has facilitated and simultaneously determined the emergence of diaspora. Thus, it has mobilized networks. Have these networks, these diasporas mobilized, and I would add, instrumentalized religion? Certainly. In the 19th century, the emergence of an Indian Ocean-wide Tamil diaspora was based on temple building. The LTTE Velala diaspora provides us with an instructive case. Wherever prosperous Jaffna war refugees went, they established one or several temples in their new states, from LA to Quebec to London to Hamm in Westphalia. Temples, especially Tamil temples, are everywhere planned, established and run by temple trustees. These are prosperous, educated and responsible community leaders. It was and is therefore no surprise that many of these temples were controlled discreetly, unofficially and very efficiently by the local LTTE functionaries. As the temples were centers for fundraising, memorial services, community meetings, charity and cultural and political propaganda, religious worship, ethnic solidarity and political support became indistinguishable. The LTTE and their Velala clients thus mobilized, globalized and utilized Tamil Shaiva Hinduism to merge it with warrior worship, the idealization of the Tamil past, and the organization of local politics and terror abroad. Thank you.
We will now have to work with this little microphone, unfortunately, so I pass it around. Basically, we have 15 minutes roughly for discussion, and I'm sure there are many questions, comments. We are looking at one paper that encourages us to question different notions of time, a bit more progress-oriented or more granular in nature, and a paper that basically redraws different types of mobility and how they are religiously framed, mobility of knowledge and expertise, mobility of people, and later on also weapons, and how they then play out in shaping reality. So please go ahead. But maybe we always collect 3 questions and then answer. Yes.
Yeah. From Bonn University Institute of Oriental and Asian Studies. My question is addressed to Srinivas' paper. I think you gave us a very interesting and fascinating case where different time concepts are intersecting in one ritual setting. But my question would be, what do we gain by using such theoretical concept as you introduced in the beginning, for example, micropolitics of discourse, poly multi-spaces, politics of possibility? What is the insight gained using these concepts in your case if you compare it to the, let's say, more descriptive language of religious anthropology or comparative religious studies? I couldn't see what is the gain.
One more question in the chat.
Thank you. Hi. My name is Cornelius from the University of Marburg, and my question is referring to Rösel's presentation. Thank you for both presentations anyway. You've done an extremely interesting case study on the Tamil diaspora, and what I ask myself now after listening to you is what about similar, not same cases as this very special case of course, but similar cases, let's say the Palestinian case with a numerous diaspora in several parts of the world. Could we generalize the ideas in a way of saying, yes, we have at least a similar kind of economic solidarity and Linguistic assertion when we look at this community, or is it a completely special case?
I don't see any more questions, so please go ahead and answer.
think that well, there are two problems here. One is the limitations of time. The second thing is the limitations of language. I think that when I use the politics of discourse, our micropolitics have changed, which is what anthropologists have used, within quotes, to describe ritual change, set against modernity, traditional discourses. I'm using it, as you rightly pointed out, fairly unreflexively. However, in the larger project, which is the book manuscript I'm working on, what I'm trying to pull out from the discursive structures, the shifting sort of regimes of temporality that the priest places in front of me, is I'm trying to build a sort of theory that accounts for change in ritual, not deriving from the classical sort of anthropological Gertzian idea, but talking about it very much from the participant's point of view. And here I think focusing on the wording is one thing, but focusing on the descriptions to talk about discontinuity is what I'm trying to do. So yes, I flee in all these words, but the idea, which clearly didn't come through in the presentation, was to interrogate them through what the participants are saying about time and how they're describing the performances that are occurring.
Okay. I would say it always depends on foremost political unity, then social, religious, cultural unity. In the case of the Velara Tamils, the LTTE has basically subdued, liquidated, executed all the political alternatives. The classical party of the Jaffna Tamils got their so-called knee treatment. They were all shot in the knee, sat in wheelchairs, and knew where the hammer was hanging, so to say. And in the Western Diaspora group, the only political alternative, a kind of, in German, Hundelfahrtskommando, the option utter war, was the only political option available, because the classical Tamil parties back home in Jaffna could not operate in the diaspora groups, because like in the story of the hedgehog and the hare, the hedgehog could always cry, I'm already there, and that was the LTTE. Now if you take, let's say, the Palestinians, the Jews, the Lebanese, the Armenians, I think they sometimes block themselves. Not all the Palestinians are standing as one man behind the PLO. They have their inner fightings and so on and so forth. In addition, in the case of the Tamil Western diaspora, it was a caste diaspora, so even cultural, linguistic English and qualification unity were all sort of coming together. So it was much more easier to come to an informed consensus on their priorities, always under an unofficial leadership, the LTTE. So if you have political unity in addition to cultural, caste and so on and so forth, conformities, you can transform your diaspora group into a sledgehammer, so to say. Otherwise it won't work.
Then I have three more on the list: Oksana, Shanaz, and
moments' imaginations, as well as their relationship between the uncertain present, the past, and the future. I'm encapsulating.
Sorry, recollect further. Shahnaz?
Yeah, it's Shahnaz Najma, the Crossroads Asia University of Tübingen. My question is also related a little bit further towards Christoph Anweiler, who just asked already. I think discussing ritual, we cannot avoid to think about Victor Turner's liminality, which is out of time and space. So my question would be, you mentioned particularly your interviews and what you got out of what the priest said during this and what is the meaning of time for them. But now you mentioned that also with the participants you have been talking. So what is the difference between what the participants who are executing, in fact, the ritual and the priest? Is there a notion, the difference between this notion of time? Thank you.
Sorry, mais is also kind of remark to your paper. Hans-Werner from Sana in Sweden. You referred in the beginning to the Viraha Bhakti, and you must be aware of Hardy's book on Viraha Bhakti, where he clearly shows that this is at the kernel of Krishnaism as theology. The connection with the Navarasa theory and the statics theory is, I think, at a later stage. That comes only later. I think that the priest and Mrs. Singha are mixing up things that make rather conventional statements. And I don't know which tradition they belong to. Well, there's probably more that you cannot talk about everything. But I would be careful about statements which you refer to time concepts. I don't see the relation of the Viraha thing to time concepts. And the same is true with reference of this famous statement in the 4th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, Samhavani Aham Yuge Yuge. It starts with Yada Yada Namase Vane Bhavati. So whenever it's not on a time concept, but it's a theology of manifestation of Krishna, which he reveals himself. So even it has the term yoga in there. I don't think it has anything to do with any significant cosmological time concept. And by the way, I find this stereotypization of Western concept of time in Hindu or Eastern or whatever you call it, linear and cyclical, I find it very superficial. But it's the guy you talked to who spoke on this. But I would like to know your opinion about this.
So we have 3 questions from.
Well, first of all, thank you for your interest and helping me think this through. The delight of doing ethnographies in formats like Babu, who do confuse things, but who provide a rich presence and text to engage and interrogate with. Now let me start with the first question about how it's linked to the past, present, and future. That's precisely what I'm trying to get at. And what is interesting, I've done this research over 15 years. So for an anthropologist, this is I know for historians this is no time at all. But for anthropologists, this is long today. This is a long time to stay in the field. And what has occurred systematically between 1998, the end of February, and January of this year was a sort of a real shift in the imagination towards using the words and the rhetoric of development and progress, to whereby the nostalgia for the past, this notion of Peter Berger's modernity, right, the homeless mind, that modernity encases within it a nostalgia for a golden past, a loss, is progressively actually degrading. There is less and less nostalgia for the past, except for this mythic past. People don't talk about the past of Bangalore, the city they live in anymore. They don't talk about the colonial city anymore. They talk about this mythic sort of Hindu past, which is very sort of nationalistically, politically girded, or they talk about the future. And this is because of knowledge because of the kind of work that the iconic people in the city do, for which they gain a lot of money, the future is very much on people's present mind. So the imagination really plays a part. Where would we be? So city developers talk about the city of the future. Land developers developers talk about how you can live in this house that represents the future. People are constantly using credit cards, payment in the future. Everything is about the future rather than the present, or rather than the past. Whereas even family, they talk about the future. They talk about the children of the future. They don't talk about our old parents. The old parents exist. So there's this rhetoric and language about the future. And what I suspect undergirds it is a terrible anxiety about the present, because the degradation of the city, the corruption of officials, the implacability of the state, etc. They feel hemmed in, so they focus instead on which. This is my suspicion, because that's what the informants say. Now, as regards the second question about liminality and Victor Turner's performance argument, yes, I'm focusing upon the performative tradition of the ritual, but I want to pull away specifically from this idea of thresholds and liminality, except to argue for moral thresholds, and let me tell you why. I think when Turner talks about liminality, he's talking about something that happens externally in the ritual that changes the psyche of the participants, yes? It changes who the participants are. But my argument is it also changes the externalities itself. It is a dual force. This is not a static thing. The ritual is changing continuously, and this is what my data shows. And so while the psyche of the participants changes, the ritual is changing. And so what is tradition when ritual changes? What is durable when ritual changes? Now, Turner did not ask that question. He asked what happens to the participants, how do they change? My argument is, how is the structure of the ritual itself changing, not only the psyche of the participants. I see it as rasabhava, as a sort of dual fold in that. And there I think liminality is slightly less helpful. I can talk more about that more specifically. The last question I'll be very. Thank you for that. I think that's a really important question. I think, yes, Babu Bhatta and Mr. Sinha are definitely doing an admixture of different concepts and sort of superficial, popularizing sort of Hindu theology from TV series and Amachara. They are not interested in the real theology of the agamas. They're not interested in this, in any of it. Rather, they're interested in giving you sort of bits of information that seem to seam it together. Now, you are of course right, right? The whole text is about Krishna's revelation as God. However, what I think is interesting is because the participants have lost or never knew, these younger people never knew the actual text from which this is drawn, they take what the Bhatta says to them. And this is what I think is interesting. So in the loss of tradition, in the loss of knowledge, we might consider it superficial, but it works. It enables them to look forward rather than all the time looking at the text. And after all, to me at least, an anthropologist, Srinivas is really based on practice. So and I can speak more on this, but there are several instances where he does this sort of, it's not that he doesn't know the text. He uses the text effectively to bounce into a different space. And he wanted to talk about time. So he decided to talk about it.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more round. If there is interest. And I also put myself on the list, actually. So, yeah, I'm quite interested. Yeah.
One brief question. I would be very interested. What happens with the network now after the post-LTE phase?
Okay. And maybe I can add my question too. Basically, I find it quite interesting how you describe how the tunnel itself basically created a space independent of the actual geographic space. Yeah? But nevertheless, this whole idea of the value and need for geographic space remains and guides men's action, obviously, to return or to keep that geographic space. So what does that mean for us, for the Crossroads Asia network? Huh? Do we need to, even if we disregard this need for focusing on the geographic space, we will still have to basically bear in mind that the whole idea of a geographic space, irrespective of it in itself, is guiding action to a degree that we can simply not ignore.
The LTE network now hard to answer. First of all, it took the Sri Lankan army 5 months, more or less, to completely surround the bunker system and the areas where at the beginning of the end round of conflict, some 350,000 North Tamils were settling. And certainly no high-ranking LTTE functionary more or less got out, and in the end round, in the last weeks of April, they simply slaughtered the whole leadership. They afterwards presented that Babakaran, his son, his grandchildren, the other functionaries as being killed in combat, but it was very clear, and it is also substantiated by now by UN reports that were basically executed. So the organization was sort of guillotined. Its head was cut off to the tune of at least 500, 600 top functionaries. So the organization is topless, which does not mean that if there will be any chance to organize again, and what kind of ELAM or whatever, that the old network will not spring to life. Up till now, as the North and East still is 4 years after the formal end of the conflict, no-go, pre-occupied area, there is certainly no chance, no interest to wage a forced ELAM war at present. Now, to your question, I mean, on the one side, knowledgeable Mr. Napoleon said, you can't eat geography. On the other side, we know from, I think, Thomas Friedman, that the Earth is flat, no longer round, because we are living in an area of electronic communication and so on and so forth. So it's always a weighting of advantages and disadvantages. And if you are a diasporic group, your main essence since 2000 years has been to technically, culturally, and so on, reduce space, reduce the time you need for communication. And the most fascinating is most of the Belala, Jaffna student and so on, refugees to the West, was always that they had a little booklet, and in the little booklet they had email, telephone numbers, institutional shopping and so on, of their personal extended family network spanning from Brisbane to Quebec to LA to Westphalia to Paris and so on and so forth, plus all their networking connections and so on and so forth. So for them, in terms of organizing, communicating, transferring weapons, transferring money, information, coming together on the phone or on the jeep or whatever, their geography is of no real profound limit.
Okay, I think we should then slowly end the first panel. I thank you very much for the two very interesting talks and the interesting questions and your attendance, basically. And I hope you enjoy the coffee.